These men and women are British subjects who have lost their homeland. They are refugees from a tiny island thousands of miles from Britain. They gather on a beach 1,200 miles from home to sing the story of how they were evicted over 10 years ago. It's as near to their island as they will ever get. They claim it was Britain that forced them out, and Britain that is preventing them from going back. Tonight, World in Action reports on Britain's other islanders. In the heart of the Indian Ocean lie a group of British islands whose beauty was extolled in a colonial office film shot in the 1950s.
Out of a total of 100 or more little islands, only some half a dozen are permanently inhabited, mostly by men and women who have been born and brought up on these fragments of land. It is the story of their lives in surroundings of wonderful natural beauty and in conditions most tranquil and benign.
The largest of these atolls is Diego Garcia, British sovereign territory for nearly 170 years. The islands were dependencies of Mauritius, itself a British colony, until it was granted independence in 1968. To generations of islanders, the Ilwa, now exiled from their homeland, Diego Garcia was the land of plenty.
Life was better there. I could get all the food I wanted. Fish, chicken and lobster if I wanted.
For me, life on the island was sweet. I had work, I had enough to eat. I wasn't living in misery as I am now.
It was a much better life there. We didn't need money. We paid in kind for our food. It was a paradise.
Nature has bestowed her beauty without reserve, as if to comfort the loneliness of the men and women who dwell on these dependencies of Mauritius.
But in 1971, all that changed. The Americans moved in, and the Ilwa from Diego Garcia and the surrounding islands were moved out. The British had leased Diego Garcia to the United States. Today, it is a naval and bomber base, a military fortress into which no civilians are allowed. This amateur film of the neighboring islands was shot by a fisherman 5 years after the Ilwa were evicted. Their houses still stand as they were abandoned. Their overgrown walls and gardens tell a story that was long kept secret from the outside world. Scattered possessions, animals left to fend for themselves. For the Ilwa, it was a hurried departure from their unhurried lives. Behind this exodus lay the global struggle of the superpowers, America and the Soviet Union. By the early 60s, it was clear that, as a base, Diego Garcia would be ideally placed to counter the growing Soviet presence in the Indian Ocean and in the third world countries beyond, which America feared might fall prey to Soviet influence. To American military planners like Admiral Zumwalt, who shaped that defense policy, Diego Garcia had long been a strategic prize.
Well, it's, in my judgment, now the single most important base outside of the continents of the various Western nations, except for our Pearl Harbor, because it is the only base in what is now the single most critical strategic theater, the region that the Soviet Union clearly covets and intends to control if it possibly can. My own personal desire was to have no indigenous laborers on the island, because I could foresee the kinds of political complications that the Soviets always make when you have that kind of an indigenous population. Therefore, I strongly advocated that there be none there when we took over and established a base.
Did the US tell the British government to remove the islanders?
My own recollection is that it was something that was mutually agreed between the two countries. Clearly, it was to the advantage of both to have that situation.
Robin Cook is one of the few British MPs who has closely followed the Diego Garcia affair. He blames successive governments for their treatment of the Illawarra.
It's perhaps worth remembering at the time, in the late 60s, there was then proposed to be a major base on the neighboring island of Aldabra. In the event, the Americans were not allowed to develop in Aldabra because it would mean disturbing the giant tortoises which roost in Aldabra. Instead, they went to Diego Garcia, which meant lifting off the island of Diego Garcia all the people who lived there. I'm afraid, in this respect, Britain turned out to place the people in Diego Garcia rather below the giant tortoises in Aldabra.
When Mauritius was granted independence in 1968, Diego Garcia remained in British hands. The only employer on the island was this coconut processing plant owned by the British government. In 1971, Britain closed the plant. All the islanders lost their jobs and they were compelled to leave to make way for the American base. Britain told the Americans that there was no problem moving the islanders because they were migratory workers with no permanent homes.
It's clear today that those islanders weren't in fact migrant workers, but that many of them had lived for 4 or even 5 generations on Diego Garcia.
That would be new information to me. I was told that they were in fact all people who had been brought in. If that is not the case, and I would want to see the proof of it.
The proof lies here in the cemetery of Diego Garcia. These photographs, taken by an American serviceman in 1975, show a burial ground uncared for and abandoned. Behind the undergrowth are the engraved names of generations of Illawarra who worked on the island. There is also the evidence of the islanders themselves. This man, Edward Venkatizan, was a plantation worker born and bred on Diego Garcia. He says his family, who had lived there since the last century, left because they believed rumours that they would be shot if they stayed.
He said they didn't leave. The Americans would be taking over the place would shoot them down.
Do you mean that you were threatened with death? Is that what you're saying? If you didn't leave the island?
No. Do you?
No.
Si you pakit zilla?
No, no.
He said they themselves, the Americans, didn't say it. It was the person in charge.
There is no corroboration that such threats were made, but the rumours spread and many islanders believed them. How much warning were you given before you were told to leave Diego Garcia?
She explains that less than 15 days before they actually had to leave the island, were they told, you know, they'll actually have to be leaving. They didn't have much time to pack anything. They took more or less what was on them, packed a few clothes, got it into a little crate, and that was all they could take.
Were you given any explanation as to why you had to leave so suddenly?
No.
They weren't given much of an explanation, but something which was said to them was that gas bombs of sorts were going to be exploded on the islands, and the kids were going to have difficulty in breathing with these gases, and so it would be wiser for them to leave in such circumstances.
In 1971, many of the islanders were shipped out in boats organised by the British. They sailed first to the Seychelles and then on to Mauritius, a 2,500-mile journey across the Indian Ocean. Some were carried on the Nordveer, seen docking at the Seychelles by Diana Scarlett, who knew the ship from a previous holiday voyage.
The deck of this ship was absolutely crammed with islanders. I could see that there were men, women and children, all ages, even a newborn baby. And they were just being accommodated on the deck with stretched tarpaulins. They'd opened up the hatch covers to make space for them to manage. And they really looked very pathetic with their bits and bobs of possessions and bundles, just looked like refugees.
How many islanders were on the ship?
I estimate there were about 150. The ship, the Nordveer, is a steamer belonging to the British Indian Ocean Territory Administration. Normally only has passenger facilities in cabins for 12 people.
What sort of crossing had the islanders had?
I spoke to the crew and they said it had been very rough and unpleasant, and that they'd been very short of food and water.
Were they allowed off the ship?
Yes. No. I think the ship was in port for about 4 days, and they were confined and not allowed to disembark, not allowed for any recreational purposes, nothing, just left there on the ship.
By 1972, 426 Illawarra families, that's 1,200 islanders, had been dumped in Mauritius. They were left to fend for themselves in the slums of the capital, Port Louis. When you arrived in Mauritius, what arrangements had been made there?
They were told they were going to get money when they arrived in Mauritius. When they got here, they received nothing.
So where did you first live in Mauritius, and what were the conditions like?
He said he should have had a house ready with all the necessary. But in fact, he had to live wherever he could find shelter with various people from place to place.
In 1972, Britain paid Mauritius a lump sum of £650,000, the equivalent of £1,500 per family, to rehabilitate the islanders. But they did not get the money for another 6 years because the Mauritian government could not devise a comprehensive resettlement scheme that satisfied the Illawarra. Instead, the government invested the money and turned to Britain for help. In London, the Foreign Office said this payment was in full and final settlement. As far as they were concerned, it was the end of the affair. In America, meanwhile, a secret missile deal had been agreed to help Britain foot the bill for depopulating the island. America slashed $14 million off the Polaris system sold to Britain to subsidize the cost of shipping off the islanders.
Nobody was told, either in America or in Britain, that this arrangement had been stitched up, and nobody found out about it for 10 years.
Well, how did the British Parliament eventually find out about it?
We only found out about it because the United States Congress set up a hearing. In fact, it's the Senate, I think, that actually carried out the hearings. One of their committees carried out an investigation into Diego Garcia in mid-1975. And out of their report came for the first time the information that there had been people on the island and they had been removed from the island, and that there had been this rather sordid financial arrangement cooked up by which we got the Polaris missiles cheaper in gratitude for what we had done.
But while British payments to the Illawarra ended with the £650,000 in 1972, Britain continued to benefit from the $14 million subsidy until 1976. Last month, as the task force steamed to the South Atlantic, World in Action went to Mauritius to report on the conditions for Britain's other islanders. This family of 25 live in a metal shack. It's one of the worst cases of overcrowding. This is the only running water that they have between them. They all share this primitive outside lavatory. They have no kitchen, just a simple shelter to burn firewood. Their food is rice, scraps, and little else. All 25 of them sleep in the same hut. There are usually 3 or 4 to a bed. Where there are no beds, they sleep on the floor. Even small children have to sleep there. And where there is no floor space, the older children sleep on chairs. This child's makeshift bed is a cardboard box under a table. What state of health are your children in at the moment?
Look at the state of her kids, you know, how thin they are. There are young children who've had to have injections, you know, things which they didn't used to have in the islands. Many of them have got boils on their skin, you know, on their body at various places. And, you know, this baby here has got, you know, abscesses on her head. And, you know, most of them are suffering from one problem or another.
Did they get enough to eat?
He said, not only don't they have enough to eat, they just don't have things to eat. He said, these children would eat properly, so to speak, only about 5 times a month. Most of the time, they would go to the shop, get a loaf of bread, break it in half, and this is what the kids would live off.
Do your children ask you, what life was like in Diego Garcia?
Huge desert. She does explain to them that in the islands, you wouldn't have had to ask several times for the same thing. As soon as you would have asked for something, you would have got it. But here, I don't have it to give you. Let's pray God that we'll be able to get back to our island sometime.
What do you miss most about the island?
He says everything is lacking here. They lack clothing, they lack food, they lack everything. He says it's, tantamount to hell living here.
The plight of the islanders has been well known to successive British governments. In 1976, the Foreign Office sent Russell Prosser, a senior development advisor, to report on how Britain's £650,000 payment should be spent. Prosser's report recommended a comprehensive welfare scheme administered by Britain. He concluded, "The fact is the Illawarra are living in deplorable conditions which could be immediately alleviated if action is taken on the lines I suggest." But the Foreign Office rejected Prosser's ideas of British involvement in the scheme. They felt this would concede legal liability. Britain decided to do nothing. Since then, Hervé Silva has conducted a more comprehensive report on the Illawarra conditions for the Mauritian government. What kinds of social problems did you find in the course of your investigation?
I think the most immediate now is housing. And unemployment is another problem. Even Mauritians are facing this problem now. Gambling is another problem, even among kids, as from 10 they start gambling. Alcoholism is another problem, women and children too drink here in this community.
Why do they resort to alcohol, do you think?
I think they will forget their problems. And in fact, when they drink, they think of Diego Garcia more,
What about prostitution?
Oh, that's another acute problem among the Illawarra. When a girl has started it, it's like an example, set in the community. All the girls now want to do the same thing. I know a girl of 12 who is the mother of a child, and another woman of 25 who is a grandmother now.
Why are these young girls resorting to prostitution?
I think they need money to live, It's kind of getting money for the family.
Mr. Silva said that the main problem caused by Britain's failure to organise a resettlement programme was housing. For the last 4 years, home for this man, his wife and 5 young children has been a small tin hut, a single room measuring about 10 foot square. What's it like in the hot season within these tin walls?
He says you sweat away, literally.
Do you manage to sleep?
Est-ce que vous aussi dormi dans une condition comme ça?
Dormi avec moi, pour faire. La case pas plus dormir.
He says one has difficulty, but since you don't have any alternative, you don't have another house, you just have to bear with it.
What was it like having your baby in the hot season in that hut?
He says, well, one has to stay here. Where else would one go? She just put up with it, I suppose.
How do you manage to cope in the rainy season when the river at the bottom of this ground rises?
He says when the water rises, it comes up to his little kitchen here and gets into the way and actually prevents them from cooking here. That's why they have to actually transfer these facilities into the house, inside the house, and that's where they do their cooking.
So not only do they have to sleep inside that one room, the whole family, but they also have to cook in it as well.
He said, yes, of course. What else can we do?
The Illawarra have fought a 10-year campaign for compensation. They bought a test case in 1975. Edward Venkatizan claimed that his rights as a loyal British citizen had been unlawfully removed. 4 years later, Britain, fearing a flood of claims, made a new offer, £1.25 million to be shared among all the Illawarra families, but only on condition that Mr. Venkateshan drop his claim. He refused, and the Ilwa continued their campaign. In 1981, there were riots on the streets of the Mauritian capital. Ilwa leaders demanded a better deal from Britain. Effigies of Mrs. Thatcher were burned. Some Ilwa even threatened to set themselves on fire outside the British High Commission. There were arrests, jail sentences, and then a hunger strike by several of the prisoners. In June 1981, the Mauritian government sent a delegation to London to seek more money. Britain increased its £1.25 million offer by £300,000. Kisha Mundil was a member of the Mauritian delegation.
Well, we had the official lunches, there were cocktails and, discussions, but the impression we got was that the British delegation wanted to get away with offering as little as, it could get away with.
The Foreign Office described that offer, now totalling nearly £1.6 million, as fair and reasonable. But again, it was refused.
They can't compensate people for the suffering that they've caused them, for the moral damage which has been caused. We just have to take this as something which has happened. You can't compensate people for that. Money can't compensate people for that. The money then was going to be used for a resettlement program, and that money was just insufficient for a resettlement program which was going to really get at the root causes of the Ilwa's problems here in Mauritius. You couldn't have a housing program worth its name with that money.
Although the British government did not come up with any more money for the Ilwa, 6 weeks later they gave permission for a $1 billion American expansion of the base at Diego Garcia. Facilities are being provided for B-52 bombers like this one, a deep water harbour for aircraft carriers, 2,500 Marines, and space for mid-air refuelling tankers. The final chapter in this affair came at the end of March this year. 2 weeks before Britain dispatched a task force to liberate the Falklanders, this Foreign Office delegation arrived in Mauritius to determine the future of Britain's other islanders. The delegation leader, Sir Leonard Ellenson, offered to double Britain's compensation to £3 million, on condition that the islanders finally gave up their claim to their homes in Diego Garcia. Sir Leonard told the Ilwa leaders, "As you will recall from our discussions last year, the British government does not accept any legal responsibility in respect of them."
Quite candidly, I find the arguments as to whether or not there's a legal liability gloriously irrelevant. The plain fact of the matter is there is a moral liability and a moral responsibility on the part of Britain. These people were on the island, happily employed, all of them employed on the island, in a viable economy. They were removed by us. We took them to Mauritius. We then left them in the very sordid conditions in which they now live in Mauritius, and we have shown no interest in them in the 10 years since then. There may not be a legal liability in the British government to do something about that, but there is perfectly clearly a moral obligation on them to do something.
Sir Leonard emphasised that the British government was concerned for the Ilwa welfare, and he described the £3 million offer as not ungenerous.
We turned his offer down, we questioned the basis of his offer, and some very tough exchanges took place. The Mauritian delegation was accused of being too demanding.
According to delegates who attended the meeting, Sir Leonard told the Ilwa leaders and Mauritians in the delegation, "I have not come here to haggle like an Oriental trader." After 48 hours of hard bargaining at Government House, Britain increased her offer to £4 million. This time it was accepted, with the islanders finally signing away all rights to return to Diego Garcia. The 10-year-old island dispute, it seemed, was at an end. But earlier this month, as the $1 billion scheme to expand the military base on Diego Garcia got underway, a new government swept to power in Mauritius. It demanded an end to the American presence and of Britain's sovereignty over the island. Last week, the new government threatened to take the matter to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So it seems that the problem of Britain's other island is not yet over. Did you think then that you would ever see your homeland again?
He didn't think he was going to see it again.
Could any sum of money offered by the British government compensate for that, do you think?
So no, one can never forget.
What do you think of the British government?
Que vous pensez des gouvernements britanniques?
That
they've been very miserly. Look at my age now. At this age, I haven't received much. They've been very miserly.
If you look back to the time in the 60s to try and explain why the Ilwa were not accorded the same attention, the same priorities as being accorded to the Falkland Islanders, one has got to face the fact that part of the reason why the same compunctions were not felt towards the residents of Diego Garcia is that they were racially different. They were not part of British stock. They may have been British subjects, but they were not themselves descendants of British people. And I cannot but suspect that that may have helped to colour some of the attitudes to them on the part of those few people who knew they existed.